April 20th at 6 p.m., I'll be at the Blue Barn Theater doing a talk on authentic intelligence, the integration of Blackness into technology. Mm-hmm. So y'all come sit and check it out so you can hear about the history of how we've invented great things and also how we've been excluded from institutions and how I'm so far over that and ready for Blackness to have its own place in the world and seen as relevant.
How long is that presentation?
45 minutes, and it's actually a presentation that we're creating and turning into a documentary. So you can come be a part of our documentary. It's actually for filming, and it's my own TED Talk because they wouldn't let me in the TED Talk. And
why wouldn't they let you in the TED Talk?
They wouldn't accept my topic. They wouldn't accept my topic.
What's up, Omaha? How y'all doing? Excellent, excellent, excellent. Welcome to my presentation. My name is Dr. Cheryl Ingram. Some people call me Dr. CI. Some people call me Cheryl. Y'all can call me whatever. One of those three. Now, if you don't know me, let me explain a little bit about who I am. I was born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska. I've been a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert for about 21 years and growing. 22 years now in August and growing. I'm also an entrepreneur. I own a number of different companies that I'm going to talk about the origin of those companies and how they got started. And then we're going to really have a conversation about what it means to be Black, what it means to own tech, what it means to take those lessons and develop them into something great to support the community, and all the challenges and pros that come with those things. All right? Can we have that conversation? Yes. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Now, some of y'all probably like, what is authentic intelligence, right? What does that mean? Let me tell you a little bit about authenticity and intelligence. So the definition of authentic intelligence is how human beings can uniquely enhance their own abilities based on their experiences. Right now, the interesting thing about that is that me being in a Black body, that means something different for me living in America, right? So as a Black woman, I have these unique experiences that have enhanced my ability to be able to exist in this world. Now, not only that, with those abilities comes the acknowledgement of resistance, of oppression, of racism, of all the things that impact my intersections that have gotten me here today, right? So when we think about authenticity, we have to think about both the positives and the negatives that have shaped me to get to that space. So I'm gonna tell y'all a little bit about that and my story. These three women really had a major impact in my life. How many of y'all grandma, y'all called her Big Mama? Yeah, that was Big Mama. We better not call her grandma back in the day. And then you have my mother and my auntie Lois, and I have interesting stories about all of them. See, my grandmother, Castine Ingram, was a community organizer. She was an activist. The first time I saw our communities come together was through my grandmother. So we used to live on 24th and Camden. And my grandmother was the first person who I ever saw create block parties. Y'all remember block parties? They don't exist so much now, but they used to exist back in the day, and I remember her bringing the community together. I also remember sitting on her porch and listening to stories about racism and listening to her also get people all the way together if they stepped out of line, right? And so she taught me a lot about honesty, love, transparency, social responsibility, and community activism and organization. Now, my mother used to run a home daycare. Now, she taught me a lot about love. She was also an entrepreneur. She was also one of the first Black tellers at First National Bank of Omaha, right, where she was severely mistreated at the time in the 70s. She taught me a lot about humility, forgiveness, what it meant to exist in the world in this Black body. And she never let me forget it, and I'm going to tell you a lot of stories about her. Now, my auntie Lois, I have a unique story about her. She taught me about mental health and forgiveness. So one day, I was in 5th grade, me and my sister Tina, and we were sitting on the couch in my grandmother's house. And my aunt had always struggled with mental health. And I drank some water that was on the table. And I drank the cup of water. I drank all the water. My aunt came out the kitchen. She said, "Which one of y'all drank the water?" I said, "I drank it." And my aunt looked at me. She turned around. She walked back in the kitchen. And when she went in the kitchen, she was angry that I had drank her water. She grabbed a knife. And where I was sitting in the kitchen, where I was sitting on the couch, I could see a beeline into the kitchen. And when I saw her pull the knife, my young mind comically thought of Halloween, Michael Myers, like, eh, eh. I was like, oh, we got to get the hell out of here, right? And so my sister was like, let's go. My mother at the time was working at La Rose Beauty Academy on 24th Street. And we ran down there, and we told her what happened. And my mother was calm. She said, okay, we'll handle it when I get off of work. I said, okay. So we get home. My mother changes her clothes. We go to my grandmother's house because at the time that's where my aunt had lived. And they had a confrontation, not a physical confrontation, just an argument. First time I see my mother argue with her siblings. And she was furious, right? My uncle jumped in between them, my Uncle Ray. And when we left, the next day, I remember sitting in front of the television, and my mother turned on a show on HBO. And it was a documentary about people with multiple personality disorders and schizophrenia. And she said, I can't explain to you in words what your aunt is going through, but I want you to understand it. So I watched the documentary with my mother, and I started to learn about mental health at 10 years old. And I was like, okay, I'm learning about mental health, I'm learning about wellness. But at the time, I didn't have that language, right? So she told me, you got to learn to forgive your aunt because you got to understand that what's happening to her is out of her control. Then she slowly but surely explained to me the limited access Black people had to healthcare, quality healthcare. And so then all of a sudden, the lesson came back again to Blackness. So most of my lessons in life, although I have many intersections, have always revolved around Blackness.
My brother used to own this, and he was selling catfish and shit out of it. And before that, it was Double O's. I remember Double O's, they was fixing cars and shit out of here. And then they turned into a restaurant.
This is the Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmark. It's a global index that we use to measure diversity, equity, and inclusion. I own a tech company called Inclusology that uses part of this benchmark in order to create diversity, equity, and inclusion assessment. There's 15 categories. All 15 categories always come full circle back to Blackness. Now let me explain something to you, and if you don't take anything else away from this conversation today, remember this. When you create racialized identities, you create racialized actions. When you create racialized actions, you create racialized outcomes. Y'all hear that? So that means that whenever you categorize people socially within race, you put them in a predicament where they have the potential to be discriminated against or to be oppressed because of race or any other identity. But today I'm talking about race because we're talking about integrated Blackness. So I don't hear anybody say to me, well, what about this? No, shut up, we're talking about Blackness, right? And so when you get racialized outcomes, most of those tend to happen inequitably or unfairly. It's disproportionate because whenever you have minority populations in existence in a workplace, educational institution, nonprofit, et cetera, there is always majority bias if that company is run by somebody who doesn't look like them, and especially white leaders. And so when you get that bias, when you see that bias, there's always a challenge with being able to understand minority stories, especially if you only measure them quantitatively. So I've created this company that has learned how to measure the qualitative and the quantitative and to look specifically at different marginalized identities compared to majoritarian identities. That means, for example, if I go into a company and let's say it's 1,000 people in that company, 50 of them are Black or 10 of them are Black. What happens is when we go to look at data, when we run assessments, we always have to look specifically at Blackness because, for example, that's only 1%, 10 out of 1,000, 1%, right? So when I look at the data, if 1% say that they don't love to work in the workplace, if you don't have an equity lens, most people who look at that conversation say, oh, well, it's only 1%. Other 99%, we doing pretty well. Well, now let's look specifically at that 1%. If 8 out of 10 people are black and you only got 10 black people, that means 80% of your black population doesn't love working in your workplace, right? Or any other marginalized identity. But I've been running diversity, equity, and inclusion assessments for 22 years now. And there's always, always trends of inequity when it comes to race, when there are people with racialized identities that are non-white in the workplace. It's like people say, well, we only have one black person and they don't enjoy it, but they don't speak for all black people. Oh, but they speak for that one black person in your workplace, and they're the only one that got there for whatever reason, which already says that you have a problem. But I learned to be able to analyze that growing up black. Just like I use that equity lens now to look at other identities. What's it like to be a woman in the workplace? What's it like to be a black LGBTQ woman in the workplace? You see what I'm saying? Because all those intersections often come back to the foundation of racialized actions, but still exist when it comes to inequity. How many of y'all remember this place? We went the other day, it wasn't open. It was supposed to be, but it wasn't. So it's the Afro-American bookstore off of 33rd and Lake. This is the first place where I learned about racialized identities in a scholarly way. So in elementary school, I got put into what they call gifted science and math programs. I was in challenge programs. And when they sent me home with the letter, my mother looked at the letter, she looked at me, and the next day we was at the Afro-American bookstore. Because she already had an understanding that if I was going to be gifted in math and science, I better understand who I was and where that came from, right? So she took me into the African-American bookstore. First book she bought me, Autobiography of Malcolm X, right? The next book I read, Autobiography of Monster Cody, an LA gang member. Have any of y'all ever read that book? Yes, yes, yes. And she said, you know, I learned about Mae Jemison. I learned about Dr. Marie Daley. I learned about Angela Davis. And my mother was sending me a very clear message that she never stated at the time, but it existed. It's in you, right? If you're gonna be black, you're gonna be in STEM, or you're gonna work in some way, shape, or form as a black woman, you better understand where you come from. And so the Afro-American bookstore on 33rd and Lake was my foundation for understanding scholarship and blackness. I understood very early that these people, along with many other great people, were my benchmark. They was my benchmark for what it meant to create innovation in a technical space. And I use that benchmark today to understand not only my identity, but also the intersections of other identities and what it's like to exist in a space, discrimination, oppression, and progression, right? What does that look like for us, and how do we make it sustainable?
I'm Christopher McMurray, owner of Dynavision Web Development and Consulting, over 38,440 hours in software engineering, established in 2013. Latest and greatest project that we're launching is going to be Dr. Cheryl's birth baby, DEI, Inclusology software as a service, relaunching in May. So look for that soon. I had absolutely zero any kind of desire to go to school. I didn't need it. But I did have what they call a grandmother that loves me and cares for me. And every time I would go over there, she would just push me and say, you know what, that's your ticket out the ghetto, is an education. So finally I picked up the first available phone book, and I just called, it happened to be Metro, but I called them, I said, would y'all please sign me up for whatever, I don't care, just sign me up for something. And I did it in front of her so she would leave me alone and be happy, because I love my family.
Right.
So then basically they said, well, what do you want to take? I said, okay, you know what, I like computers, so just sign me up for computer. Then she said, well, do you want to do networking, programming? I said, okay, I'll do networking. I hated that. Then I said, well, I'm already a year in. At least one thing about me is that I was taught if I start something to finish it. So I'm on the course, I want to do this degree. I said, I might as well do it now, so I'll switch over to programming. So my first course was Java 1, the language, Java 1. And then I'm like, wow, so this is how they do it. This is how you build websites. I can actually write code. I can control things and innovate based on my mind. And the only thing I got to do is perfect my craft.
Yeah.
And I just ended up falling in love with it. So I actually unlocked the passion. So, shout out to Grandma for saving it. Made me probably grow to love it is I love the fact of being in control and knowing that the only thing that's stopping me from creating the next greatest thing is me. So I have the ability to say, you know what, based on what I put into it, this is what this app or this website, whatever it is this is what the product is gonna be. I can create my mind. So I like to go and use my mind to create. I mean, it's limitless what you can do with technology. So the only thing that limits is up here, So that ability to create, nobody can take that away. Nobody can control that.
But I want y'all to go on this journey with me of understanding Blackness and all the things and how that creates innovation within us. And part of the reason for that is I think that when we hear about Blackness, when we teach our children about Blackness, we don't often do it in a space that perpetuates innovation and creativity for them. Right? So how do we do more of that? These institutions are the institutions where I grew up or where I went to school. Shout out to Benson High School if you in the building. If you ain't, I ain't hating, but don't you boo me. And from Miller Park to Drew Hill to Beveridge to Morton to Burke to Beals to Benson High School. And it's an interesting thing that I learned because I've lived in Omaha, Nebraska. I lived here for 18 years before I went off to college. I moved 17 times during that time. So I've been to a lot of schools. Out of all of these schools, only 3 of them had Black educators. And those 3 Black educators were some of the most impactful people that I've had in the classroom that taught me a lot about what it meant to be a Black person, especially at the time when I lived in North Omaha and was getting bussed out to schools like Burke and Beveridge. Let's talk a little bit about Omaha corrections. My brother is in the crowd tonight. And I asked him if it was okay for me to tell his story. My brother got arrested in the 90s because he had 220 bags of marijuana, and they gave him years in prison for it. Now, it's an interesting concept because even till this day, that was, 30-some years ago, bro? And they still won't take it off his record. 220 bags of marijuana, right? Still considered a felon, still can't get certain benefits because of that kind of mistake. What they also did was they took my mother's daycare.
Back then, it was like 10 grams of marijuana.
Yeah. And how, shit, what year was that?
1990.
1990, yep, I was right, 1990.
And as a child, we everybody go through their ups and downs. You grow, you learn, you try to figure this life out, especially without proper guidance.
Come through with a word.
Because I know myself, I used to be out here as a child running these streets. Running the streets means various different things. Whether we was popping wheelies on bicycles, trying to wheelie the whole block, playing football in the streets, running up and down with our forms of track and field. And that was at a early young age, but then you start getting a little bit older where it starts being not enough. So then you start dibbling and dabbling out in the streets. And that comes along with the drugs, the guns, the gangs. I think we was one of 3 blacks on the block when we first got here. But this has been a journey.
Yeah, for sure.
I love y'all, man. Love what you're doing, baby girl.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Man. Love you, bro. I'll let you.
All right, I'll let you later. So we were one of 3 blacks on this family back in the late 60s.
And that's what I want people to understand is we grew up here, we seen all sorts of terrible things. And not unspeakable things that he's seen, you know what I'm saying? And we still managed to take the skills that we learned here and create something great. And I think our community needs to understand that it's cultural wealth here. And when I say cultural wealth, I mean the knowledge that you learn, the things that you see, and the oppression that you face will make you great if you let it.
Yeah.
So my mother had a daycare since the 80s, late 80s. And when my brother was staying in her basement after he had gotten out, they took her daycare because they found out that my brother was living in her basement. He was a felon, all right? Wiped out her source of income, caused me to take on extra jobs in college to support my family, to try to help out. And it was one of the shittiest things I've ever seen my family experience. And I remember the day that it happened, my mother crying in the courtroom when they took her license, right? I still get upset about it. But I learned about institutional oppression in a way that I had never experienced it directly. But we always knew that it exists and that my mother prepared me for because she expected it because we was existing in the world black. 1999, after I graduated from Benson High School, I went to New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Huge, huge culture shock for me because I was from North Omaha and everything around me, everybody around me looked like me, sounded like me, talked like me. And then I got to New Mexico and it was very different. And I remember when I first went to New Mexico, I had people say, why you want to leave the United States? I was like, it's New Mexico, y'all. Come on. And it's interesting, when I learned about diversity, equity, and inclusion at New Mexico, it's because my first job was in the Multicultural Center. Now, let me tell you something about Multicultural Center in most colleges. When you go to the Multicultural Center, what that is a center where they hub most underrepresented and under-resourced populations. Black programs, Chicano programs, American Indian programs, veterans, people with disabilities, disabled people programs. And it was interesting because they used to, one, make us compete for funding, right? And they never used to fund us. $10,000 a year for funding that we had to fight and compete for and justify why we needed it. But it's okay to have it during Black History Month. You can do your events then, but why do you need it for the rest of the year? When we went to New Mexico, I went down to Las Cruces with 13 friends, all black, from Omaha, Nebraska. We went down there together like a caravan. Only 2 of us graduated out of the 13, and the rest came back home. And I created this I thought about this interesting narrative of why my friends at the time were leaving college and why did I stay? Because people used to say, well, you made it, you're a doctor, it's accessible for everyone. Girl, stop. Look. So I started to do a lot of research on why colleges pushed black students out and underrepresented populations out of college. And it was the most interesting thing because at the time I was in grad school when I really got deep into research. And I remember sitting at a table, I was working for the Bridge of Southern New Mexico, and I was looking at data analysis to see why mostly Hispanic children were dropping out of school at the time and how much that was economically costing our society or our state of New Mexico. And when I was doing the research, it was the most interesting thing. I got called into a meeting with the president. I had to go with her, the president of our organization, because we were raising money to start the first early college high school. So we go to this dinner. I walk into the room, the governor of New Mexico is sitting at the table. The superintendent of Las Cruces School District is sitting at the table. President of NMSU is in the conversation. President of our organization, and then me, the only black person at the table and the youngest person at the table, right, with the least amount of influence at the time. And I was writing notes, and at the time, the governor says, well, we're creating a product. And I'd look up like, a product? Is he talking about a book or is he talking about people? Right? And let me tell you where I flash back to, Benson High School. How many people went to Benson? There's a few, okay, just my homies in the crowd. How many of y'all know Alonzo Tapp, Lonnie Tapp? Y'all remember Mr. Tapp? Mr. Tapp was my African American history teacher. I took his course in high school. During that time, he showed us Roots. We watched every volume of Roots. And he taught us about the history of what it meant to be black in America, from when it first started to where we were at the time in the 90s. And I remember Mr. Tapp talking about how the dehumanization of black people. And as I was sitting at the table in New Mexico, I immediately thought about how the governor's words had created the dehumanization of Hispanic children, right? Latinx children. And I was like, damn, I'm back here again, but my frame of reference is Blackness. I understand that that's wrong. Right? And so I'm doing this data and I'm thinking to myself, how are you going to spend this data in a way that teaches him that it's not just the student's fault that they leave college? So I write up this report. I go do a bunch of research. I'm looking at why students leave educational institutions against their will. And I found this book by Michelle Fine that talked about the push-out rate of students as opposed to the dropout rate. And so I said, okay, so There's people who do scholarship that are understanding that institutions are more likely to push marginalized populations out. So I go and I rewrite this data, I rewrite this report, and I send it to them and say, yes, every student that drops out costs the state of New Mexico $6,666 a year if they are less likely to finish high school. And then the next part 2 of that report said, but let's talk about why they leave, without pointing the finger at them. So then I produced all this data that talked about the level of poverty in New Mexico, how they created barriers for people who are immigrants and or come from backgrounds where they may not have had access to formal education and or could afford it because of poverty, right, and the exploitation of immigrant people in that region, and just in the United States in general. And interesting enough, we raised, I think it was $10 million in order to build Arrowhead, which is the early college high school in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And part of that research helped to change the curriculum for how they taught students, right, and how they supported students. Because I was understood at that time, I gained this understanding of what it meant to create spaces that were inclusive for underrepresented populations. But the foundation of that started because of my Blackness. Right? It gave me that lens. It made me understand that the world operated different for me because of the way that I looked and the fact that I wasn't white. And boom, here I was, the dehumanization, and at the same time, simultaneously still working in the Department of Black Programs and watching the mistreatment and retention rate of Black students go down. Or the retention rate of Black students go down, mistreatment of Black students tend to increase, right? So I said, okay, I'm onto something here. Let me go get a PhD and really, really dive deep into this research. So I did my PhD. I finished my PhD in 3.5 years. And I have a book called Soulful Words, shameless plug if you ever want to look at it. It's the testimony of 9 Black students about the discrimination against Black students in academic and social settings within higher educational institutions. So I followed these 9 students for 2 years. I listened to their stories and I put them into 3 groups: the push-outs, the graduates, and the current students. And I learned a lot, and a lot of that helped me to start my companies, but let me backtrack a little, because here I was, a PhD student, I graduated from college, I was one of the only Black students in my class, and I applied for 448 jobs. I got 2 interviews, 2, right? And I thought I was a hell of a student. And I was published. I was in journals. I was doing okay. And I couldn't get a job. And so I ended up taking a role as an AmeriCorps Vista in Seattle, Washington, earning $24,000 a year. And I was, wow, you're right, say it again, wow. And it was interesting because at the time, I had moved into a house where I was sharing a room with another person, and we was going back and forth, sleeping on the bed and the floor. Because that was what I could afford, making $24,000 a year in Seattle, which at the time was the 3rd whitest city in America and the 3rd most expensive place to live in the U.S. Right? But they gave me opportunity to go work for a Bold and Gold Fellowship, which was teaching students outdoor curriculum about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and helping to recruit more Black and Indigenous people of color into that program. First day I was there, we were sitting in a circle, it was onboarding. It was like 12 BIPOC people, 30 white people. And BIPOC, I'm saying Black and Indigenous people of color. So I'm sitting in the room, and I'm looking around the room, and I'm like, gosh, I'm here again, right? One of the only ones, here we are underrepresented. And the first thing that the director of the program does is she hands us their diversity plan. It's 1 page. Right, that's what I said. I was like, oh, here we go. And in that moment, you know, the thing about my grandmother and my mother is that they tend to not bite their tongues for anybody. Neither do I, right? Always respectful, but always honest. So I raised my hand. I said, excuse me. I said, is this the actual plan, or is this like a summary, a succinct version of what y'all are doing? The lady says to me, this is our plan. And I look around the room, and something said, it was like an ancestor whispering in my ear, say something. I said, this is the whitest diversity plan I've ever seen. And the lady was so taken aback. She was like, do you mean like because it's on a white piece of paper? She was looking at me like, what? And I was like, let me explain. How you develop a diversity, equity, and inclusion plan that doesn't single out any identities, that doesn't talk about race, that doesn't talk about diversity, that doesn't talk about the actual issues that y'all are facing. I was like, this seems very sugar-coated. Who wrote this? And she's like, well, our administrative team, you know, whatever, yada, yada, blase, blase, to make a long story short. I said, this is not going to work. Not if you want to teach underrepresented populations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and or if you want to employ people who come from diverse backgrounds. But they didn't listen to me. And when people don't listen to me, I tend to leave that space if I feel like I'm not respected. I lasted 3 months. And I was getting ready to leave Seattle. I was packing my bags. I was getting ready to call my brother, get money for a bus ticket. I was out. And I had applied for jobs at the time. The day after I got done packing my bags, I got a call and got a job offer to stay in Seattle. And I was honest. I said, look, I don't think I can afford to stay here. I'm on a AmeriCorps salary. Lady said, we'll give you a bonus if you stay. We want you to help run our academic program to teach us about how to build curriculum for underrepresented, but at the time they were saying urban youth. And we want you to manage our tech team and then help with the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Council. I said, all right, cool. So she gave me a bonus. I stayed. I was there for 3 years, from 2013 to 2016. And I remember having the same problem that I always had, that diversity, equity, and inclusion didn't seem authentic enough. And the reason why I always thought that is because I had grown up in the world Black. I understood what oppression looked like. I felt it. I endured it all the time, right? There was never a moment where I went someplace where I didn't think about the fact that I wasn't Black unless I was surrounded by other Black people, right? So one day, I'm sitting in a staff meeting, and I'm killing it at work. Y'all, I consider myself a high performer, as do most people who manage me. And now I manage myself, though. But I'm sitting in this room, and I had redone all of our assessments because the goal was to get more underrepresented populations in the building. So I was focused on increasing the recruitment for women, for immigrants, for Black and Indigenous people of color, for disabled people, and I was killing it. I was getting them in the door. Within 9 months, we saw a substantial increase, almost 50%, especially for women in our program, but also immigrants, people that were disabled, underrepresented populations. And they showing it, they praising us. They're like, we're doing a great job. We're getting these people in the door. Diversity is increasing. Guess what else was increasing? Turnover. Again, it made me think about New Mexico State because here I went to school with 13 people. Only 2 of us graduated. I entered this program and diversity was increasing, but the biggest pain point was the fact that our turnover rate was 70% Black men. Wow. Right. That's what I said in the meeting. And I felt this moment of shame because I was like, how did we get here? How am I here again? Right? And why am I now seeing these numbers? Right? Y'all showed me the recruitment numbers, but not the turnover numbers. And now that I've seen them, I feel like nobody here is actually listening to me. So slowly but surely, my mother passed in 2015. And it was this aha moment. And then I had to have surgery, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later. I decided to leave and start my first company, which is Diversity, because that slide for me was the 1,000th cut. I had it. I was like, I need a plan to start my own business because clearly here I am working with enterprise companies, I'm working with nonprofits, I'm working with educational institutions, and somehow nobody's actually listening to me when it comes to actually going below the surface level to change your strategies and the way you implement diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. I couldn't live with that. So I started my first company, Diversity, and Diversity took off when it started. It was extremely successful, still is till this day. I'm now the president and no longer the CEO as we are currently growing and moving a location to Omaha, Nebraska. Yes, we'll be here soon. Y'all stay tuned. But the interesting thing is that when I went into diversity, equity, and inclusion with Diversity, I started going to free programs to try to understand how to build a business because I wasn't an entrepreneur. I come from a family of entrepreneurs and people who had done it successfully. So I'm running audits, I'm working in companies, I'm seeing sustainable things happen. But the problem now for me is that it's taking too long, right? Because the diversity, equity, and inclusion audit at the time could take a year to complete, up to 6 months to complete. Once you complete the audit, once you get the data, once you build the strategy, then you got to implement the long-term and the short-term plans to be able to do that. And that was just taking too long for me because, and the reality, my reality check got cashed about our audits because I interviewed a Black woman who was an executive in a company. She said, we got the strategy. I looked at your long-term goals and I looked at your short-term goals. I don't think I'm gonna make it 3 years here trying to figure out what to do next. It's too hard being black in the workplace and a woman. So I had this aha moment in 2019 after I had a conversation with her. This was 6 months later, I started Inclusology. So I said to myself, I'm a fixer, right? I grew up a fixer. How am I gonna speed this up? So then I created Inclusology, which is currently my tech company that exists here in Omaha, Nebraska. Now, Inclusology is the only all-in-one diversity, equity, and inclusion management platform. What does that mean? It means that it does diversity, equity, and inclusion assessments. It has a built-in database of questions for diversity, equity, and inclusion assessments. It does e-learning, where you can get certification online with trainers. It does benchmarking, because remember I talked about my benchmarks, and it looks at the 15 categories that you've seen for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it breaks it down by every identity and intersection that a human being has. When people hear that, they're like, oh, where'd you learn to do that? Being black. I learned to do that because I grew up in the world black. Where first I had to understand what that meant, because that was what people saw first, and then I had to overcome the challenges of the intersections that came along with that and watch the people that I love do the same thing. So if you want to talk about how great my company is, understand that that greatness came from blackness, right? And it's going to continue to elevate. And of course, we serve all populations, all identities. But the matter of the fact is that that wouldn't have started if I wouldn't have experienced the world the way that I did as a black woman, right? Growing up in North Omaha. So then I created this tech company. And in 2021, after the pandemic hit, I decided to open a production company called Courageous Productions, which is also opening in Omaha, Nebraska. And the interesting thing about Courageous Productions came because I advise large production companies and entertainment companies in the U.S. I'm their diversity, equity, and inclusion advisor. I sit in on calls sometimes with terrible people who say terrible things about underrepresented populations, even though they don't understand that those things are as terrible as they think they are. Some of them. I'm not giving everybody an out. Some people know what the hell they be saying. Some people don't. But I've sat in calls where I've had to have conversations where I've had to advocate about why someone with natural hair should be included in a commercial. I've had to advocate and teach people about how to not discriminate against other people while on set. And then I've sat through superficial conversations where people who were too dark couldn't get in front of the camera. Right? This is 2021, 2020, and now 2022, still having those conversations. So I said, all right, again, I'm a fixer. So I'm gonna build a company that allows people who often don't get the opportunity to be in front of the camera to do that. No matter what your weight, size, skin color, et cetera is, how do we create a platform and a company that does that? I said, so, okay, I'm gonna create a production company, and now I'm gonna create a holding company that owns all three of these companies. And then I'm gonna do it in North Omaha because that's where I come from. And see, my mother, before she died, we had a real hard conversation. And my mother loved North Omaha. I could barely get her to leave. She would barely come visit me in school. But she said to me, you know, I know that you're going to be great. You got it in you. You're already doing great things. No matter how big you get, no matter how great you become or whatever you do, don't you dare forget about North Omaha. And I sat on the couch with her, and she said, also, don't you ever be ashamed of who you are and where you come from. Can you make me that promise? I said, yeah, I got you. I'm going to make sure I do that. So now I've created this vision, this leadership, and this structure for these companies to exist, manifest, grow, and scale, and help create generational wealth in North Omaha. And the foundation was built on blackness, right? The creativity, the innovation, the thought behind these companies always came because I was always interacting with discrimination and oppression.
My name is Trayvon Brooks. I'm originally from Wilmington, North Carolina, but I fell in love with Omaha. The reason this means a lot to me, growing up in, a traditional Southern family, seeing some of the struggles that my family went through, made me early on realize how important it is for families to build wealth, for families to start and grow businesses. The reason why entrepreneurship has evolved communities like Atlanta, that is the reason why I'm so passionate about this work. And I honestly, with all my heart, feel like Omaha can be that for the Midwest.
What is your vision for building a black startup ecosystem in Omaha?
Good question. So So I think the vision is to replicate some of the things that we've seen across the country, right? So we look at the Atlantas, we look at what Austin's doing now, even what Colorado's doing, but we want to compete. In Omaha, we want to be the mecca of black startups in the Midwest. So if there's a startup founder, there's a black entrepreneur, as they're deciding on where to start their business, we want Omaha to be at the top of their list, plain point period. We want to be where people start and grow. We want to be where the next LinkedIn is created. We want to be where the next Calendly is created. We want to have multiple tech leaders here locally, multiple startup founders. We want to be the place where other states and city looks for direction whenever it comes to supporting a black startup ecosystem. Here in Nebraska, one of our number one assets is access, right? But a lot of times we don't talk about the opposite end of that. You know, sometimes we live and die by the access, and sometimes in communities like parts of our state like North Omaha, the access is hard to get, right? So we all always say it's a phone call state here in the state of Nebraska, which it is. If you get access to the right person, you can get anybody's cell phone number. But if you don't have access to those people that can give you those numbers, you're hurting. So part of that is, how can we effectively invest our time, effort, and energy to make sure that our communities like North and South Omaha have access? And that's one of the reasons why, you know, my office is in the North Omaha community, and we're opening up the South Omaha office. So the importance of making sure that the strengths of our state are also the strengths of our communities is highly important. But then also we're seeing traditional things that we have to be able to tackle that we're seeing across the country, right? So access to talent. Talent's on a premium. Talent's hard to get wherever you can go, especially with remote work. If you're talented in Nebraska, that means you can be talented in California, right? And so that means if Microsoft wants to hire you and wants you to stay in Nebraska, that's an opportunity. So we have to be able to figure out how to compete there, but we also got to be an attraction, right? We have to figure out how young talent is willing to come to Omaha. How can we make sure that as people making that decision, not only for themselves, but for their families, Omaha is part of that list. So we have to make sure we're competing in those areas. And that's highly, highly important. But it's one of those things that we're going to have to really get some good folks, some smart folks in the room and say, how do we keep you, your friends, your families in Nebraska, and how do we attract the next one?
I feel like the world right now is at a time where wellness is an extreme challenge, especially if you are an underrepresented population, but also for everyone. Now, me being black, there was this question that I asked myself, what you gonna do, right? How you gonna take all these lessons that you learn, how you gonna put them back into the world? And in the process of that, there was a lot of self-work that had to come with that. There's a lot of healing and forgiveness. So I went back to thinking about the fact that my mother, my aunt, and my grandmother taught me about community. They taught me about wellness. They taught me about forgiveness because they're also very religious people. And it was an interesting space to be in to learn what that truly meant. And now I'm in the space of taking that and transferring it into practice through my companies to help teach for other people. But also, let me be clear that I don't have it completely figured out, but I'm doing a pretty good job of navigating it. You know what I'm saying? And so the idea of thinking about being black in the world and taking the things that I've learned and transferring that to other people, because I think it's important for our people to learn that our cultural capital exists and that you can create innovation and build a beautiful life from it, but you also have to be able to navigate the barriers in the world while also trying to teach the people who build the barriers how to take them down. And excuse my language, that's a hard-ass job, right? And I'm sure many of y'all do it in many different facets. And doing it while underrepresented or in black is really hard. Here we are in 2022, and by 2027, I have a plan. I said I'm going to build 5,000 comfortable wage jobs in Omaha, not livable wages, because I have a problem when people say, we need a livable wage. I'm like, what do you mean livable wage? No, we need to be comfortable in our wages. And so I'm currently working to build a tech company that does that. I'm now at $705,000 that I've raised in my $1 million seed round and potentially looking to close on $1 million by mid-May. And that's the start, right? And then thinking about generational wealth, what it means to heal communities in a way that is sustainable. We're looking to create a social impact fund that helps underrepresented business owners, especially in North Omaha, with a specialization in Blackness, but also willing to help other underrepresented founders. But look, when people are like, I'm like, I got this interstate that I'm building. Right now, Blackness is the lane that I'm driving down. You know what I'm saying? And I may switch over to other lanes to help be an activist for other people, but I'm always going to come back to the lane of Blackness because that's where it all started, and that's where it's going, and it's going to continue to go. Inclusology is growing slowly but surely, and I'm trying to create a sustainable and impactful way to build diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace that people haven't seen it done before, right? Because I think that we've gotten into this space now where everybody wants to do diversity, equity, and inclusion. As you should, right? But there's a way to do it, and there's a way to not do it. You know what I'm saying? There's this polarity in the spectrum of how to do it and who to do it for, but it can't be superficial, which is where we see most of it playing out right now. And then I'm also looking to partner with educational institutions in order to build accelerated tracks for our people who may not have the skills but are looking to get the skills for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and even people who are currently in jobs that are looking to build that competency. So see, the goal is sustainability. The goal is generational wealth. The goal is to watch communities, especially North Omaha, flourish when it comes to building a foundation for generations after us to create and live upon. So this is where we are. This is where I'm going. Y'all mark my words, next 5 years, I'm big on manifesting. I'm spiritual. I'm manifesting 5,000 jobs. If I get to 10, I'm going to be even happier, but 5,000 is the minimum, not the maximum. Now, I know some people, I've heard conversations about Omaha, you got new Omaha, you got old Omaha. I'm like, look, as long as everybody's working towards the same goal, I don't care which part of Omaha you exist in, right? So, you know, I'm in this space now of understanding that collaboration is necessary, especially in our community, in order to get where we're going, and that if we really want to build a beautiful ecosystem for startups, especially black startups in Omaha, the world needs all of us in some way, shape, or form. And so I'm here to work, as I'm sure many of y'all are already doing. I'm just playing catch up.
If ever there's a tomorrow when we're not together, there's something you must always remember. You are braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think. But the most important thing is, even if we're apart, I'll always be with you. And that's crazy how this shit right in front of my grandma's house. The day I come up, I ain't been here. My grandma's old house, because I ain't been here since 1993 after she died. And yet I walk up to her house, it's the first thing I see. Meaning in that. All right, let's get the hell out of here.
I also have to give a shout out to the matriarchs that taught me and to my nephew that died last summer, because he was the reason I decided to pick up and come back to North Omaha. That was the breaking point of building my company here and accelerating the date to do that because of his passing. So I have to give a shout out to the people that I love, because they've helped me build this legacy, and they will never be forgotten, and they really are part of the reason. Thank you. Q&A. I'll take some questions.